Criminal barrister and author Daw KC.
Chris, a top lawyer.
Daw KC, a leading barrister and author.
Daw,
the barrister, the writer and broadcaster. Daw QC.
Daw, why haven't we won the war on drugs yet?
Because it's an unwinnable war. You can't win a war against a substance by definition, and substances have been around in terms of intoxicants since. Well, I wrote about this in my book actually. So the first evidence of cannabis use was something like 10,000 years ago. This is by human beings at funerals in China, where they used to burn cannabis leaves, and everyone used to like see the dead off with a strong. Well, it smelt a bit like walking around East London, to be honest with you, does these days. So. So the answer is people love drugs. Some people love them and they can stay reasonably healthy and sane on them. Other people, unfortunately, become chronically addicted to them. But the one thing that's always going to happen is that people are going to take them. And so a war, it's a bit like having a war on air or a war on water. You know, I mean, it doesn't make sense. It's part and parcel of the human species, and not just humans. I mean, animals eat leaves, which have intoxicating effects and things like that. So it's part and parcel of being a human, and of the human species is occasional intoxication. There is actually an argument that we co-evolved with certain hallucinogenic plants, and those hallucinogenic plants may have been responsible for some of the huge leaps in human intelligence, which are now responsible for the world that we live in. So, you know, people having, you know, creative leaps or thinking of technology or a way of doing something that they hadn't done before. The use of intoxicants and hallucinogens over many thousands of years have just been an integral part of our condition as humans. And so launching a war on it for entirely political reasons in the moment, which was in about 1970-71, so that war that you've just described, now over 50 years old, nearly my whole lifetime, is an unwinnable war. You fight wars you can't win, you will not win them.
What's the solution then?
Stop trying to fight a war you can't win. So you have to, if you accept as a basic premise that there's going to be a certain level of consumption of drugs, and if you accept as your second premise that the most important thing is to keep people healthy as possible, and is your third premise that you want society to be as safe as possible. So you want there to be no drug gangs, murders, stabbings, etc. over drug territory. You don't want young children being used to ferry drugs around the country on county lines, etc. If you accept those three basic principles, you would move immediately to a licensed and regulated drug supply system, which emphasised safety, which emphasised consistency of dosage, ensuring that you minimise overdose risk, and which prioritised access to healthcare for those who need it, for those who are, you know, addicted and perhaps who want to stop taking drugs, as a certain proportion of drug takers do at any one time. Provided you provide all of the infrastructure around supporting people, you will just end up in a licensed and regulated market where the harms of drugs are dramatically reduced. They won't disappear. I'm not pretending there won't be a black market of some kind. There always is. And I'm not pretending that children won't get hold of drugs, even in a licensed market, just as they get hold of alcohol now in a licensed alcohol market. But overall, you would dramatically reduce the harms, you dramatically reduce the prison population, and you would dramatically, perhaps most importantly of all, you would dramatically reduce the number of people dying of overdoses and dying on the streets. And for me, that's the guiding reason why we need to do something very, very different, rather than just doubling down on the same mistakes.
How would it look different to the alcohol market now? Because I know you mentioned that if we were like going and removing the alcohol prohibition now, we do it in a different way where it's not so much of a free-for-all. So how would the...
Yeah, I mean, you're right. So it's interesting. I was I can't remember where I was. I was at a football match recently, and they had the TVs in there, but you know, when you go to the bars and stuff like that, and they're advertising alcohol, and there's obviously alcohol available readily at football matches and all over the place. And the truth is, if you started from here with alcohol, you wouldn't make it quite so freely available, and you almost certainly wouldn't allow it to be advertised and promoted, and particularly promoted in a way that targets young people, because that just doesn't make sense. It is a toxic substance, and it is a dangerous substance, which does need to be treated in that way. And drugs are no different. So for me, what you wouldn't do is have them on sale at every petrol station, every supermarket. You know, there wouldn't be a whole row of drugs in Tesco's or whatever. You would have licensed premises where people could go and buy pretty much whatever they wanted, provided they were adults. But under controlled conditions where you know, you would have to show your ID, you have to prove your age, and you would have access in those licensed premises to advice about, how to avoid the harms of drugs. I mean, a lot of that is out there now. If you think about it, there are charities, there's things like Frank and about mental health, and then there's drug charities and all these things. And they exist already, but the problem is it's very difficult, because if you're telling someone about alcohol, you'll say to them, okay, so many units a week is kind of just about going to be as healthy as you can be and still drink alcohol. But with drugs, it doesn't work like that, because you've no idea what you're taking. You don't know how much is in there. So that's, I mean, one of the major reasons why I went on this journey of kind of drug legalization was the people that came to me, parents who had lost teenagers, young teenagers in some cases. There was a young woman who I wrote about in my book, who was only 15 when she died of an ecstasy overdose. And she died of an ecstasy overdose in a very interesting sequence of events, and tragic, obviously, a horrific sequence of events. But the sequence of events was that she and her friends got some ecstasy. They took the ecstasy. Her mum found out, wasn't too cross, wasn't too strict, but just said, like, I'm worried about this, because I'm worried about what's in the ecstasy. What do they put in it? If it's just, if I knew what it was, I might feel a bit more comfortable. So the next tragic thing that happened was that this young girl went to her friends and said, look, I spoke to my mum. She's kind of understanding, but she's really worried that I'm taking all sorts of stuff. So how do we make sure that we get something that's not full of stuff? And so she got a 99 or 98% pure MDMA powder, which of course was very pure, but unfortunately she took enough to kill 10 grown men, and she died within an hour. And so if you could buy drugs in the same way as you buy alcoholic products, where there's a label, where you know exactly how much is in each tablet, exactly, where you are, that's a far safer state of play than teenagers, particularly underage teenagers in parks, taking powders where really they have absolutely no idea what they're putting in their bodies. And for me, we need to protect everyone, not just young people. Everyone needs to be protected. If they make these choices, which people do, particularly young people, they need to be able to make the choice in a way that's safe. So even a 15-year-old, of course, one would never encourage 15-year-olds to take drugs, but if they're going to, in a licensed and legal market, they're going to be buying drugs that are from the legal supply chain. So they're going to be still going to have, just as when teenagers get hold of a bottle of vodka, it's the same vodka as you get in the supermarket, and everyone knows exactly what's in it. And that's why, for me, it's so much safer. If you can monitor and regulate what's in the packet and what's in each tablet or what's in the powder, as much as who gets it and how they get it, which is equally important in keeping us safe on the street.
You mentioned earlier on how politicians are very keen to push this agenda of the war on drugs. So why do you think they're so keen on bringing down the law instead of this narrative of acceptance and distributing it safely?
I think it's a vicious circle, because I think what the problem is that every time there's an election, anyone who stands for election, whether it's, my principal focus in politics is on US politics, UK politics, and to a lesser extent, world politics. But when you look at the UK and the US, every time there's an election, and every time if any politician were to stand up, particularly a presidential candidate or a prime ministerial candidate, and say, I am in favour of legalising heroin and making it available to heroin addicts for free, which is what they do in Switzerland. In fact, it's a constitutional right for people who are addicted to heroin to get heroin from the state for free in Switzerland. If you advocated that policy in the UK or the US, your numbers would just fall through the floor, because you would open up the platform for the other side to say, this is the drug dealer's friend. This politician wants to get everyone on drugs. What kind of a leader would we get? They're in favour of legalising heroin. Can you believe it? And when you say that out loud, like legalise heroin, legalise cocaine, when you say those things, you don't have to say anything else. You don't have to say why that you are advocating that it would be wrong to legalise it. It's enough to just say, it's crazy. Are you crazy? Legalise drugs, legalise it. Crack, cocaine. If you say that out loud, you can see very quickly why politically it's impossible. And the problem is, I guess, in a democratic society, or one of the benefits, depending on which end of the telescope you're looking from, is that in a free society, people are entitled to vote on the basis of emotion or fairly ill-informed reaction. No one's obliged to read the evidence before they vote about any given individual policy. People can just do it from the gut, which is why, of course, so many politicians are elected who frankly don't have any rational kind of game plan, and who don't do a great deal of harm, simply because they resonate, their messaging resonates, even if the underlying messaging is inaccurate, and even if the science behind whatever the policy they're advocating for is completely the opposite of their position. And almost nobody cares, except people who perhaps have a professional or an academic interest in the subject, and no one votes for any of us. So, so the problem is elections, the problem is democracy, but also without either of those two things, who knows where we'd be, because they have equally crushing policies, even more dangerous and damaging policies against drugs in non-democracies like Russia, for example, and the Far East, certain Far Eastern countries, and the Middle East. So democracy alone doesn't explain it, but it is a very easy speech to make, isn't it? If politician A is standing for president and says we need to do something different about drugs, let's stop locking up all these young people for drug offences. The other one says he wants to let drug dealers back on the streets, and you're going to vote for that. Well, democracy is often a very binary and simplistic thing, and of course most people don't vote on the basis of what they might consider for themselves to be relatively insignificant policies in their lives, because the point I made at the beginning about drug use being prevalent and universal, it is, but only amongst a minority of the population at any one time. So the majority of the population, particularly the older population who tend to vote the most, are the least likely themselves to take prohibited drugs. Of course, they're highly likely to drink alcohol, but they're less likely to take prohibited drugs, and simply less informed about the science behind addiction, which I think I think your generation is much more attuned to the fact of addiction as an illness, as a condition which is inheritable genetically, which where propensities are very, very strongly linked through the family line, whether it's towards alcohol, towards particular forms of drugs, whether it's towards obesity and certain kind of eating habits. These things are genetic. They people inherit the tendency or the preference for certain behaviors, including the taking of drugs, which are very different between different people. I mean, we all know that drug taking is not, much as it might be characterized as all the same, there is a vast difference between those who take relatively small amounts of drugs relatively infrequently in a manageable way and maintain the control of their lives, and those whose lives are entirely destroyed by addiction on a day-to-day basis, to the point that it lands them in prisons, in hospitals, and of course out of work and out of education. So there's a huge extreme, but at the end of the day, people tend to vote in elections, in my view, after watching elections since probably about 1980, 84. 84 was really the first US election I watched properly. But watching elections now for about 40 years, people vote, I think, on either an emotional reaction to a particular politician who's very charismatic, or they vote on the basis of naked self-interest. So what's going to be best for me? If I'm a pensioner, who's going to put pensions up the most? And if I'm in work, who's going to increase my wages, and how am I going to get more money? How am I going to buy a house or a bigger house? Who's going to cut my taxes? So once you start getting into all of that, peripheral policies that only kind of engage a minority, albeit a very large, are policies which often simply don't really get on the radar at election time at all. And even if they did, I think for the reasons I gave you a few minutes ago, I think most people will be persuaded by the anti-legalization argument, because it's actually easier and simpler to get your head round. I'm against drugs, I'm against drug dealers. So let's just may have more laws about drugs and lock them up for longer. And that's what we do. That's why we've doubled our prison population in the last 30 years or so. And that's why drugs and drug gangs are the cause of so much violence on the streets.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you raise the point of people being like against drug dealers and against drugs, they're, instead of being against the crime, they're almost against the criminals. So politicians are in favor of punishing criminals rather than eradicating crime, because they're sort of taking the crime to be the criminal's fault rather than the system's fault.
Well, precisely. So that you make a good point. So before the Misuse of Drugs Act came in the early 70s, we had a system in this country of heroin prescription by doctors, and it was actually called the British system. And the British system had a very, very small number of long-term heroin users, but they were all prescribed heroin quite legally by doctors who were licensed to prescribe heroin. And before the Misuse of Drugs Act came in, the best evidence is that there are about 1,000 long-term seriously addicted heroin users who were obtaining heroin from their doctor, who mostly lived a normal life, apart from going to the doctor and getting prescriptions and taking heroin once or twice or three times a day. Pharmaceutical heroin, of course, not street heroin. And then Richard Nixon came along and said, we're going to have a war on drugs, and we're going to make sure that we're going to attack the use of drugs all over our society, and not only in America, but we want all of our allies, if they want to continue to be US allies and have our support and our money, they must sign up to this same law as us. So all of the kind of Western world, and most of the world, in fact, signed up to the Misuse of Drugs Act or its equivalent, and the US law was passed, I think, in 72. Ours was passed in 71, and so all around the same time, all over the world, suddenly drugs were all not only prohibited, but prohibited and seriously and highly criminalised, to the point that if you got caught, you would go to prison. If you got caught dealing, you go to prison for a long time. And that's got longer and longer and longer over the years. But all of that stems purely from Richard Nixon desperately wanting to win the 1972 US election, and it was a very powerful message. The war on drugs, the evil in our society, the dealers, but also the users, the users on our streets, the people who are robbing your cars and robbing you at gunpoint, all these people that, as you say, they create these kind of like evil kind of caricatures, really, which are very helpful to politicians when they're campaigning. And having done that, we're now stuck with the consequences, because from 1,000 habitual heroin users in the late 60s, we, by the mid 80s, had 300,000 heroin addicts taking street heroin and committing crime to buy the street heroin, fueling organised crime by paying organised criminals for the heroin, to the point that we had the crack epidemic of the 80s, which also spread like wildfire, all because no longer could people obtain drugs in a lawful way. No longer was there a licensed supply chain. So the only choice was to turn to the streets. And if you turn to the streets, you create a market. If you create a market, you create a supply chain. If you create a supply chain, you create profit. And if you create a supply chain for something that people really, really, really want a lot of, and have very, very limited price sensitivity to, because particularly in the addictive kind of market, you're going to create a massive worldwide trillion-dollar industry, which we are now seeing to this day. We are seeing thousands and thousands killed on the streets of Mexico, killed on the streets of the Philippines, even by their own government. All of this come from that acorn of the Misuse of Drugs Act and the Nixon's war on drugs that started over 50 years ago, and over my lifetime has mushroomed into one of the most extraordinary. You know what? The most extraordinary thing about the drug trade is it is a really clever and well-run business. I mean, when you think, if you ever watch Narcos or any of these shows that kind of like I appreciate drama, but you watch anything about the drug trade, you watch any of these programs that show you how the cartels operate, or if, like me, you've spent 30 odd years working in criminal cases, working with, for major drug dealers and drug traffickers in criminal cases over here. These people are highly sophisticated business people. The only difference is that they have no regard for the law. Their businesses run outside of the legal structure, which means not only do they ignore the criminal law as far as drug supply is concerned, but they never pay any tax either. So, because their income is all in tax, it's all in cash. So, or most of it is in cash, or it's been laundered, but it's certainly not in a form that the government sees any of it. So we've created this trillion-dollar worldwide industry supplying a product that's really, really popular. And the only people that benefit financially are drug dealers. And the rest of us pay through our taxes, from the police, for the courts, for the prisons, for the medical consequences of people taking illegal drugs, which are not safe. All of these things are paid for by us, because politicians can keep going back to that old message about drugs being bad, drug dealers being bad, drug users being bad people, and they keep repeating it, and people keep buying it, and sadly, we're paying the price.
I mean, you touched there on how over your lifetime you've seen longer and longer sentences for drug offences. With the most bloated Prussian population in Western Europe, why do we keep doing it? Why are we putting more and more people in for non-violent offences?
It's a good question, and again, I'm afraid it comes back to the same answer, which is that it's politically very popular. You may or may not remember, a few years ago there was an election where Boris Johnson was elected in a landslide a few years back, the last election but one.
It's a sentence you never want to say, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not a sentence you ever want to say, but Boris Johnson was elected in a landslide, and amongst the policies that he very strongly banged on about on the campaign trail was prisoners are being early released. They're being released too early. We're letting them out at half of their sentence, and we need to increase the amount of time people spend in prison. So But why? No one ever said, well, hold on a minute. What's the rationale there? The rationale, of course, is it sounds tough. It sounds like someone finally is giving these prisoners what they deserve, which is more time in prison. And people love that message. They absolutely, it resonates with voters on an enormous scale, and it resonates with voters. The beauty of that argument that was made by Boris Johnson and Priti Patel, who was the Home Secretary at the time, the beauty of it is it resonates with all voters, even sort of fairly kind of, even young voters often are attracted by that kind of messaging about like bad people. These are murderers. These are rapists. These are these are really robbers. Why are we releasing them early? All of that. Well, point you were making, I guess, is that not all of them, in fact, most of the prison population are non-violent offenders, as it happens. But when you have people willing to be emotionally carried by these sorts of arguments by politicians, populist arguments, which aren't evidence-based, have no rationale except that they sound good, then what do you expect? You're going to get ever increasing prison numbers. And part of it, to answer your more direct question, I suppose, which is why do we in the UK imprison at a much higher rate than the rest of Western Europe? The answer is because I think it is part and parcel of the Anglo-Saxon kind of psyche and tradition, because the same thing is the case on an enormous scale in the US, where in my book I described what I call the US city of incarceration, which would be the fifth largest city in America if it were a city, and that's the prison population, which is at the time was around 2.5 million. It's still well over 2 million now. 2.5 million people in prison in the United States. Not far off 1 in 100 of the entire population is in prison at any one time, and it comes back to the same thing. There is a cultural kind of addiction to punishment and imprisonment and incarceration, particularly making the incarceration tough, which goes back hundreds of years through the Anglo-Saxon psyche. And in fact, I trace it back in the book, going back to even further to Greek justice and Roman justice, where the idea, and even Old Testament justice, the idea of an eye for an eye, etc. The idea of vengeance and punishment is very, very heavily ingrained in the psyche of Anglo-Saxon societies, or those societies which kind of are English-speaking countries now. So Australia has a high prison population. The US has a high prison population. Canada has a fairly high prison population. All of them, in comparison to other cultures which have a very different kind of historical, linguistic, and sort of psychosocial kind of history, if you like. So lots of other countries have had long periods where violence has been inflicted on the population, or they've been kind of treated very badly. The people have been treated very badly, but the difference is that the culture around crime and justice on a sort of day-to-day basis, so take away wartime, take away extremes like the Nazi regime, and you just look at the way that societies operate in peacetime. Our society operates in a very vengeful way, even when it's economically very successful, and it still has a very kind of pent-up anger towards certain people who may be seen to be on the wrong side of the law. Whereas other countries see the whole thing very differently and are much more pragmatic. And I think that that's the major difference between what I call the Anglo-Saxon mindset and more the European mindset. And the difference is that the Anglo-Saxon mindset is about vengeance, it's about words, it's about anger, it's about emotion. Much of the kind of European mindset is much calmer, and it's about pragmatism, and it's about solutions and what works. And that requires maturity. It requires a high level of education in society, and it requires, I guess, journalism to be objective a bit more, to have a bit more depth to it. We do live in a society, don't we, where even if you just go to the supermarket and look at the selection of newspapers, particularly the tabloids, the extreme opinions about people who have committed a crime, and particularly children who have committed crimes, that kind of ferocious demonization that you get in the British media in particular, and increasingly, of course, on social media in both the US and the UK, that vociferous kind of nasty kind of negativity and complete lack of context, complete lack of understanding that people in prison are 15 times more likely to have been in the care system than the rest of us. And you say and in fact, there was a statistic, I think it was like at one time, there was 60% of the whole prison population were care experienced, had been in care at some point in their childhood. And nobody's putting the two and two together. No one's saying, hold on a minute, they've been in care and they're 15 times more likely to go to prison. when we say in care, that means in care of us, the public, because we are looking after these children. We're putting them in children's homes or foster homes, and we, as a society, are providing the parenting for these particular children who, and we do it so badly that they are overwhelmingly less likely to have employment, education, and are overwhelmingly more likely to be arrested and go to prison. Whose fault is that? It's not theirs. It's ours, because we took on the responsibility of parenting those children. And it's no good saying well, what about the parents? What about the parents? They too are often deeply damaged and traumatized individuals. They too have had a history of addiction, of psychological, of homelessness, of severe relationship breakdown, of witnessing trauma and violence in their communities. So if you've been through all of that and walked that walk, then you earn the right to be judgmental. But even if you have, it's not even an argument for someone to say, well, I grew up in that community and look at me, I've got a good job. Good for you. Lucky you. But I tell you what, many, if not most others, are not so lucky and don't have the bits of luck along the way that allow certain people to navigate one environment in a successful way and others to navigate it in a way that sadly leads to harm for them and harm for others. Once you have a degree of empathy and understanding of how communities operate and why so much crime is in very small pockets within our societies and very small areas where violence is rife, where drug crime is rife, but other areas where it's not, and where actually the streets are very, very safe, and you can walk around and not expect to get robbed at knife point or gunpoint. Once you understand that, there are very, very different communities, and children growing up have very different experiences, and those who end up in young offenders institutions and in prisons are the ones that, generally speaking, have had the most trauma and the least advantage in their childhood, and the ones who have had to, for reasons outside of their control. Even if you blame the parents, in inverted commas, which no rational person would, but even if you do, you can't blame the child. You can't blame a child for being put into foster care as a baby because their parents were incapable of looking after them. You can't blame that child. When you do that, you as a society, in my view, are in loco parentis. You take over the responsibility for those children in your care, and you actually take on that responsibility, in my view, into adult life too. Just as a parent, I've had my first of my children turn 18 a few months ago, and she's an adult, but she still, as far as I'm concerned, remains my responsibility in the broadest sense for the rest of my life, because she's my child. I chose to have children, and I take that responsibility. And as a taxpayer who pays for children's homes and foster care and all the other things that are used to try and support children who don't have a parental kind of support network, I believe I have that responsibility too, and that means I can't say in conscience that a young person in care who's got themselves ensnared in drugs or some other part of life through absolutely no fault of their own should be demonized for the rest of their life as a criminal, because they either take drugs, sell drugs, commit relatively petty crime, often non-violent crime, and just end up in a kind of a vicious kind of revolving door of courts and prisons. It's all completely insane, completely irrational, and most of all, it's completely lacking in pragmatism. Whereas other countries, as I say, Switzerland is one of them. You think about Switzerland, right? What do you think? Well, you think that's a posh country, quite conservative, quite a rich country. Can't really imagine them being too liberal about drugs or crime or anything like that. And I actually went to interview the Attorney General of Switzerland when I was writing my book, and I sat down with him, very kind of well-to-do kind of Swiss guy, spoke perfect English, beautiful office looking over the lake in Geneva, and really a quite stodgy conservative type. And he had a policy. They in Switzerland, they do not arrest drug dealers unless the drug dealers are causing a problem. And the drug dealers in Geneva actually are invited to town hall meetings, where if there's a problem, like if a dealer's gone near a school or they're hanging around too near people's homes where they're taking their children out, the people say, look, this is wrong. And then the drug dealers go, okay, we'll sort it out, because the drug dealers know if they don't sort it out, they're going to get arrested and they're going to go to court. But if they stay out of everyone's way, if there's no violence on the streets and they keep things calm, then they're allowed to go about their business. Now, that's not the model I advocate, obviously, because I'm advocating licensed drug supply. But at the same time, as I said earlier, the Swiss, some years ago, and this was interesting because this was by a process of referendum. The Swiss government system, as you may know, there's a very large proportion of law in Switzerland is decided by referenda, right down to local, like what should we have a new swing set in the park? There'll be a vote on the little tiny street, and everyone will say yes or no to stuff. So they had this culture of referenda, and the reason why we ended up in a situation where the Supreme Court of Switzerland made it a constitutional right for addicts to be treated as disabled in the same way as anyone else with any other condition, physical or mental, which impedes their life. The reason we ended up there is because in the 80s, heroin use got out of control in Switzerland, to the point that the railway stations were full of heroin addicts. Literally, there were people lying around with needles coming out of their arms, in major railway stations, dozens or hundreds of them at once. And you can look it up. You can see some of it. In fact, there's a picture in my book of one of the parks where it was called Needle Park, where it wasn't really called that, but it was a park where people went and took heroin openly in the street. And the people of Switzerland didn't like that. They didn't like going to playgrounds and finding needles that had blood on them, under the swings and stuff like that. That wasn't very, good for their life and their children. So they basically put pressure in one local area to start with in Zurich to create safe spaces for drug use. So they created what they were called shooting alleys or something along those lines as a sort of slang term, but they're actually they're places where people can access medical care. They can get clean needles. They can be tested for HIV and other things, but they can also go and inject heroin in sterile conditions very safely. And I visited these places. So they allowed that to happen. And then suddenly what happened was that the railway stations gradually kind of emptied of drug users. They also changed the approach to drug dealing and, as I say, started to enforce only where there was a community kind of friction, if you like, and it caused real problems in a community. So they changed their enforcement. And then over the time, someone had the bright idea to come up with heroin-assisted treatment, which is even more kind of liberal, if you want to call it that, but in my view, pragmatic. And heroin-assisted treatment means that you go along, and I've been to these places in Switzerland, you go along and it's a beautiful clinic. It looks like a private clinic. It looks very nice. It's not. It's actually a state-run clinic. And it's run by psychiatrists, addictions experts, etc. And the people go along and they are given free pharmaceutical-grade heroin in the morning to inject. The strength, the doses, the frequency are all individualized because everyone has different tolerances and etc. And all of that is done scientifically to the point that if somebody goes there and they do overdose, and it really doesn't happen very often nowadays because of the supply chain being largely regulated. But if they do, they have the medical team there to make sure they have the drugs that can kind of overcome an overdose, bring people back to life. Which are very, very successful, by the way, work very, very well, particularly for heroin and opioid overdoses. And all of that is available to people. And nowadays, if you walk the streets of Geneva or Zurich, as I've done, and you go to the railway stations, you'll see a few homeless people. You'll see that as you would in Manchester or Oxford or anywhere else. But what you won't see is that huge number of heroin addicts, and you won't see crime on the streets, and you won't see. When I spoke to the Attorney General, he had a police liaison who took me on a tour of the drug dealers. He took me round Geneva, showing me where the drug dealers were operating, where they were sort of allowed or tolerated, if you like, and where clearly they were not allowed to go anywhere near schools and where young families, etc., etc. And I was talking to him. This is about 5 or 6 years ago, and I said to him, on the streets of Manchester or London or most of the cities of Britain, there's a lot of drug-related and gang-related violence and fighting each other. And he said, well, that's unheard of here because they know that if they do it, if they stick with the program and they don't actively target children and they don't start stabbing and shooting each other or stabbing or shooting the cops, they will be left alone. And drug dealers are not stupid people. They don't want to get arrested. They don't want to have their stash seized. They don't want to go to jail. So in that environment, most of the drugs that are sold on the streets are social supply drugs. Yes, there's cocaine sold on the streets. Yes, there is ecstasy sold on the streets. Of course, cannabis in massive quantities sold on the streets, as it is pretty much everywhere these days. But heroin, which is the primary drug of addiction on the streets and has been in most societies alongside crack for a long time, heroin is mostly supplied through the heroin-assisted treatment program or is taken in consumption rooms where people are under medical supervision. So the year that I went, which was 2019, as part of my book research, they had not had a single overdose on the streets of Geneva that year, not one. And in Glasgow the same year, they had over 500. So deaths from drug overdose. Now that tells you take your choice as to which of those policies and which of those societies you think has got it right. At the moment, Scotland in particular, we're seeing vast numbers of overdoses and drug deaths, all of which could certainly be mitigated. I'm not saying you can reduce that from 500 to zero overnight, and they didn't do that in Switzerland overnight. It's taken them 25, 30 years to get to the point where drug overdose is that rare. But if you just for a moment think about the difference, almost zero in a city of a similar size with a history of significant drug use. I'm not saying it's as deprived as Glasgow. Of course, I understand the economics are very different. But even so, almost zero drug overdoses versus over 500. For me, I choose the policy that leads you towards zero rather than the one that leads you ever upwards.
I want to bring back to children, Chris, because you touched on that a moment ago. In the Victorian era, 70% of the prison population were orphans. And now you're telling me that, you know, you're 15 times more likely to be criminalised if you're in the care system. That's like 150, 200 years apart, and we still haven't fixed anything. So what are the steps that we need to take as a society to, like, guide those young people without sort of figures to help them?
Well, it's very interesting that you asked that particular question, because it is one of my passions, is the criminalisation of children, the over-criminalisation of children, and to the point that I kind of came to what I believe is the pragmatic and rational view that you should never criminalise children. I also think it's fair as well, because for many, many reasons, not least the ones I gave earlier about the disadvantages of most of the young people that come into the criminal justice system. Not all, but most come into it as a result of some degree of life trauma, which was outside of their control, or multiple life traumas. So the answer to me is, if you have a young person who's 10, 11 or 12, and they find themselves arrested for having a knife or having or selling some drugs, which of course will usually be someone else's drugs that they're being asked to move around, but all of those things, to me, that's a cause for an intervention. That means that what you need to do is you need to say, we've got an 11 or 12-year-old child here who's in an unsafe environment. And it may be that they've been violent. They may have themselves have been violent, but the violence, anyone who is violent at in that age group is also at the most extreme risk of violence to them. And so you know, the two things do go hand in hand. But the point is this: they are in an unsafe environment, and the priority should not be to put them into another unsafe environment, such as a young offence institution, which is even more unsafe. But it should be to take them to a place of safety, where you remove the triggers, the influences, the factors on the streets or in their life, which are causing them to go down a route which is damaging to them and possibly harmful to others. And that means you have to have available to you well-funded schools, some of which are secure, some of which are not. You know, you can't go home, wander around, do whatever you want on the streets, but are first and foremost, and in fact only, focused on education, rehabilitation, and on the welfare of the child. And that the system is, there's a few countries in the world, but the most prominent one, another small country, and I accept a wealthy country with very different kind of economic and social conditions, but Luxembourg. The Luxembourg Constitution was amended so that no child could ever be convicted of a crime as if they were an adult until the day that they could vote, the age of 18. And at that point, and there's arguments, I have to say, and I made a speech last week to the YMCA conference, and someone was talking about, you know, well, what is the kind of the correct age of criminal responsibility, and what should you do? And my argument's a very simple one. If you are not old enough to vote on the criminal law, then why can you be criminalised and sent to prison? Because you've got no stake in the laws that are being applied to you, but they're being applied to you as if you did. And that's unfair. But perhaps most importantly of all, the outcomes, the recidivism rate from our system of criminalising children as young as 10, compared to those systems which have much higher ages of criminal responsibility, the recidivism rate, it goes from something like almost 100%. So almost 100% of young people sent to young offenders institutions will reoffend. It's almost a complete failure, if that's one of your measures of success, as it should be. Whereas those societies which do things differently, and so within the Luxembourg Constitution, it says that the primary responsibility of the state is to the welfare of all children until they're 18 years of age, whatever they've done. That doesn't mean that you don't protect others from dangerous and very violent children, but you have to remember there's hardly any. There are very, very few. The reason why these shocking cases, the Jamie Bulger thing from many years ago, and these sort of cases become, and the ones we've seen recently of knife crime and horrific kind of violence committed by children under 18 against older people and murders and so forth. The reason why you get so much coverage is because it's so extraordinary and it's so unusual, because it doesn't happen very much. And so, unfortunately, what's happened is we've made our policy as if it's an everyday thing, as if on every street corner there are 10-year-olds stabbing people to death. They're not. It's a once in a decade. It's a once in a very, very rare situation. And so what's happened, as with so many other things, is that because things are rare, and because they're shocking, they get huge amounts of publicity. They engender politicians to weigh in with an opinion about well, why won't these judges lock them up for longer? Why is that sentence? Why is this? He's killed someone. I don't care if he was only 13 at the time. He should never be released. And that kind of mindset, it prevails across the media and across social media, and it is absolutely, in my opinion, one of the major reasons why our criminal justice policies are so mistaken, and why our, as you use the word bloated, why our prison population, our criminal justice system is so bloated, so overloaded, is because we have not got our heads around the fact that if you divert children from the criminal justice process, instead of putting them right in the middle of it when they're still children, the chances that child will ever end up in a prison will be reduced by 80 or 90 or even 95%. Because anything is better than criminalising a child. Almost anything you do is better than criminalising them, and definitely anything's better than locking them up in a young offenders institution, which is just a child prison. It's a prison. I've been to them. I visited them. I filmed in them for the BBC. They are prisons with bars and clanging cell doors and all those things. And I sat in a room for the BBC with a group of young people, of which the youngest was 14, in a prison with bars and prison guards wearing prison uniforms. 14-year-olds. And if anyone out there ever wants to know what it's really like, they need to go and visit one of these places. There were young people doing their Duke of Edinburgh at the age of 16 in a prison, having to camp in the middle of a prison with walls and bars and wires. What is that going to do to you as a 16-year-old? Looking around, and that's your horizon, is a 40-foot high wall with wire on it all the way around, rather than the state saying these children need something. They need to have access to similar experiences to the rest of us, because if they don't, then they're going to be different forever. They're going to be othered. They're going to be treated as separate. And I've used this sort of analogy before, but my view is when you criminalise a child, and particularly when you put them in a young offenders institution, you may as well tattoo criminal right across their forehead, because they'll carry that with them for the rest of their life. They won't get a job. They won't integrate into law-abiding society. They won't succeed in education. And as I say, everybody's going to treat them as a criminal for the rest of their life. And so what happens when you treat a child in a particular way? They behave to type. They behave to the way that adults treat them. And if you treat them as children who don't deserve to be respect, that don't deserve education, that deserve to be punished and shouted at by judges and told how terrible they are, then they are going to go out and commit more crime, because that's just basic human psychology. And we as a society are stupid enough to have let this prevail for so long, and it's getting worse and worse.
Oh, I was just going to say, talking about children in prisons, you mentioned in your book, I think it was Feltham, that they...
Feltham, yeah.
The guards have sort of bets on gladiatorial combat between kids. And
yeah,
I
mean, that was a
horrendous.
particular period in its history, and that did lead to a number of deaths in that institution. I was speaking about a well-publicised and specific sequence of events at Feltham, which resulted in a number of the officers being fired and attempts to kind of reform the place. But the truth of it is that it is still just as bad. I may or may not have the sort of gladiatorial kind of element to it, and the sort of really sick stuff that has gone on from time to time in young offenders institutions, and frankly has gone on in children's homes, and frankly still does go on in children's homes to this day, in terms of criminalising, abusing kind of children, and essentially turning them again into kind of just feral. They're treated like feral creatures, and in a way that is deeply inhumane when you think about the society that we hope we live in. But you make a good point. Places like Feltham and the other, I've been to many young offenders institutions over the years, and even those which have the most progressive regime, even those which do their best with education and everything else, are still prisons. And the psychological impact of that on a child, for me, I don't know how any child ever recovers from being put into prison as a child.
I mean, I think Harry was touching on that sort of I think there is a latent baying for blood. The tickets being sold for the hangings outside the Old Bailey. I think we do still like to see, as a society, we like to see people punished. My question to you though is where do we get this money from? Less archaic prison facilities, rehabilitation programs for children, drug-assisted treatment. It's expensive, and
No,
you
no,
know,
it's cheaper. It's way cheaper.
is it? Go on.
This is the myth. So this is the madness of it. So the cost of processing the average young person through criminal justice. If you take a young person who's been in care, who starts on that fairly predictable journey of initial engagements with the police, usually not over the most serious things, but then it gets more serious, and then they're absent from their children's home. Maybe they're being abused themselves. They're taking drugs, etc. So you start all that, and then they get into the cycle of being arrested, youth courts, like not turning up for appointments with their probation officer, and then it ends up being breached, and then they go all of this stuff. The cost over a lifetime of someone who becomes really seriously involved in that world and ends up as a revolving door. And I talk in the book about a client of mine who went in, I think, the age of about 14 or 15 for the first time. And by the time I was representing him and he got another life sentence for something stupid, he was in his 50s and he'd been in prison for 30 years. The cost of that to the society for him is about £2 million. £2 million in today's money. Okay, so just think that through, what you can do with 2 million in terms of drug assisted treatment, in terms of youth support and youth support workers. This is for one person, remember. This is one person whose net contribution to society economically is minus 2 million. That's the current state of play, right? So if you get that down to minus 200, you spent 200,000 on him when he was 12. It's a bargain. And you reduce the spend on police enforcement. Of course, some of this is linking up together. So some of this is, yes, if you look at children in a different way and you pour resource into to 10 or 11 and 12-year-old, rather than pouring resource into the 60-year-old prisoner who's just back in again for another 6 years and costing 50,000 or more per year to be in there, more than it costs to go to Eton, or maybe it's about the same as going to Eton these days because of that, but whatever. But it's not far off the cost. Pretty much the same. Boarding at Eton, being in prison. What the hell are we doing wasting that much money just warehousing people for them to come out and not never have a job? So that you make a good point, Ted, that you do need some upfront investment to kind of make it work, but you also need to take big, bold political decisions, which we are as a society, we're going to say to ourselves, we can do better with children and young people than simply criminalising a huge number of those who come out of the care system. We can do better than that. And yes, we might have to invest a bit of money to get to where we want to get to, but within a generation or less, I think within a decade, if you were to be progressive and pragmatic about policy for young people around drugs and around reducing our addiction and use of incarceration, I think genuinely, my view is it's a 50-50-50. It's you reduce the amount of crime in our society by 50%, you reduce the prison population by 50%, and you reduce the amount of money we spend on criminal justice by 50%. And it's a magic trinity. All three can be achieved, but unfortunately, the politics are taking us in the opposite direction.
I'm glad you've answered like this. I mean, I've grown up, dad's a solicitor and various sort of cuts to legal aid and just increasingly disastrous. But can you make the case for, I'm a British taxpayer and I'm going to pay, £20,000 of my salary to tax. Why should it go to the justice system rather than to health, to education, to things like this? Why does the justice system need more funding?
No, I think the point I just made is to agree with you. I agree. Don't spend 20,000. Spend 10,000. Because by changing policy, you'll be spending a lot less. And at the moment, you're spending the 20,000 on the justice system to have full prisons, to have the police overstretched to capacity and not able to come when you get burgled because they're dealing with something else and because they're so overstretched by kind of antisocial behaviour, drug raids, huge numbers of sexual offence investigations that never end. We're in a society where we're wasting that 20,000 in tax today. I'm proposing to save you tax. The problem you have is that the argument isn't a pragmatic one. As I was saying earlier, if it were pragmatic, everyone would say, "Oh, I'd much rather pay 10,000 to 20,000 towards criminal justice." But when a politician says we need to lock people up for longer, what's the consequence on the taxpayer? Just think it through. If you're looking at someone up for 8 years instead of 6, that's 2 more years, 100 grand more that the taxpayer's got to find to pay for that person. And it's a very significant reduction in their prospects of ever becoming a taxpayer or having employment. And so, you should be asking that question not to me as someone who's proposing reducing what we spend on criminal justice and making crime reduce and making society safer. You should be asking it for the idiots that constantly clamour at every election to lock people up for longer, particularly around the drug trade. When I started as a criminal barrister in the 90s, if a client got 10 years, a 10-year sentence, which in those days you'd serve about 6.5 years for a 10-year sentence. That was we called it double figures, and double figures was a scary sentence. People used to think, 10 years, that's a really big whack. You're inside for 6.5. Nowadays, drug dealers are getting 30 and 35-year sentences, of which they have to serve 20 or so years. £1 million to lock up a drug dealer for 20 or more, because they'll often be in high security conditions to start with. £1 million for one drug dealer. Okay, so your dad's right to complain if he's complaining about his taxes, or whoever does. You're right to complain because it's such a waste of money. Because you're spending money to achieve the opposite of what you want. And the way there's a really straightforward kind of equation for me, or calculation that I make, which is anything you do in criminal justice, does it have the tendency to reduce the amount of crime in our society, and does it have the tendency to make society safer so there'll be fewer victims of crime? And if the answer is yes, it sounds like it's probably a good idea. But if the answer is no, it sounds like it's probably a bad idea. And the answer is no for almost everything we do. Almost every element of our criminal justice policy leads to unintended consequences and perverse consequences. So the more that you crack down, as they put it, on county lines, etc., drug dealing, which is mostly means arresting more children, the more children go into young offenders institutions, and the more long-term professional drug dealing criminals you create. So good for you. If that was the plan, well done. But if you've got a rather more sensible plan, which is to try and avoid people being robbed for their watches on the streets of London, as part of sort of organised drug gangs and or just to find enough money to get enough heroin for a couple of days, if you're happy with that, great. You carry on voting for the status quo, and in fact, why don't you vote for double sentences and build more prisons? And lo and behold, that's exactly what many people are trying to do right now.
Yeah. I mean, the way in which you make very persuasive arguments. You should do it for a living.
I'm thinking of going into it. Yeah, I once made a best man speech at a wedding, and nobody knew what I did for a living, or very few people did actually. Some people did, but not everyone did. But someone who didn't came up to me and said, that speech was really good. I think you could definitely do something with that. You could definitely be a public speaker. And I said that's very kind. And actually, if you think about it, if you can make a best man speech at a wedding, then it's not easy. One of you guys will have a go one day. It's not as easy as it sounds.
Well, in your sort of 30 or so years at the bar, what have you seen to change for the better and change for the worse? That's a lot of experience now.
Yeah, I think the changes for the better, which are incremental changes, but not so. But by no means have we finished some of these journeys. But the changes for the better, I think, are that there has been a larger intake, a more diverse intake into the profession. So when I started out as a sort of comprehensive school boy from Milton Keynes, there were very few state-educated young people coming to the bar. More in criminal law than perhaps than other areas, but really still a minority. Nowadays, I think it's switched around. I mean, it's still a much more disproportionate number of privately educated, if you like, compared to the population. But that's changed. I think that certainly proportion of women is higher. The proportion of ethnic minority kind of barristers is higher, albeit none of those are. If you go up, the further you go up the profession, the less diverse it is, for reasons which are perhaps obvious, because the intake is drawn from the generation. So if you're looking at judges, mostly in their sort of 40s and 50s and 60s, they've been at the bar or they've been solicitors for 20 something years, so they go back or longer, which means that that intake was predominantly middle class, was predominantly white, predominantly male. So it takes a long time to kind of break the glass ceiling or break all of the ceilings at each level. But I think that's a positive, but I'm not for a moment trying to be complacent about that. My view is that we could do a lot more as a profession. We could do a lot more as a society to make it more representative, particularly in criminal law, where sadly, for reasons which would take a long time to go into, there's a very disproportionate number of black and ethnic minority people in the criminal justice system being prosecuted, being sent to prison, and serving prison sentences. But if that's a fact, and it's wrong, and it's something we do need to address, and that could be a whole different podcast, to be honest with you, as to why that's the case and why there's this huge disproportion in terms of criminalisation of certain races and certain communities. But that being the case, it is surely vital as a profession that we are as diverse as possible. Because I remember when I started out at the bar. I mean, I'd say it was a very ordinary school, very multicultural kind of environment. And so I kind of like had grown up with people of all races, different backgrounds, etc., etc. And so when I went to the bar, I had candidates from different backgrounds. That wasn't like a shock to the system because I'd been to school with all sorts of different people, and it really wasn't an issue to me at all. But many of my colleagues had never met a black person, had never met an Asian, literally never met a black person or an Asian person, and often had never met someone who'd gone to a comprehensive school. I mean, it was quite remarkable. They were like, "Oh, really? Oh, you went to that school? Well done," and that kind of thing. And so. And I would see them talking to their clients, and the clients would be looking at them as if they were spacemen. And so what I recommend is I think you really need to think about this, Becca. And they'd be like, what's that, mate? What are you on about? What? You're saying I should go guilty on it or what? Like, and so that the sort of disconnect between the sort of like the client base and some of the barristers, it was really quite extraordinary and a bit embarrassing, to be honest with you. But that's changed a lot now, and it is much more diverse. So I guess that's a good thing. The bad things, are we moving on to bad things? Do you want bad now? I can't remember if you asked me if you wanted bad.
Yes, that's
anyway.
bad one. That was
well, you'll know, given what your dad does for a living, and what you've said in terms of your knowledge of sort of legal aid cuts, etc. That the headlines are very straightforward. We've doubled the prison population to the point that they are so full that we almost can't fit anyone else in them. The courts are so overloaded because of the decision to keep prosecuting for so many things that are non-violent, where actually another route, a diversion from criminal justice, would be much more successful in keeping that person away from future crime. We just keep locking people up. We keep increasing sentences all the time, and the cuts in the legal aid system and in the the prosecution system as well mean that really the resources for cases to be dealt with properly are just not there. And the best stroke worst example I can give is the treatment of victims of sexual violence and rape, who have to wait on average 5 years from being raped to give evidence, and that is the 1 or 2 or 3% who ever make it to court at all, because the vast majority never even make it to court because there just isn't enough resource. If every single complaint of rape was charged, we'd need 5 times as many courts just to deal with those. And so we just don't have the resource. Our courts are full. If you remember last summer, when there was all the rioting after the terrible murders in Southport, we managed to find space in our prisons for loads and loads of those rioters within a few months. Unsurprisingly, we had to adjourn rape trials and robbery trials because we were making room for dealing with all of these rioters, and then looking to lock them up for really long periods, rather than kind of, and that looks great optics on the media. Look how serious it is. Someone's got 5 years for rioting, etc. It looks great, but the consequence, the knock-on effect for an already massively underfunded, under-resourced system, we're paying the price now. We are almost at the point, I read over the weekend, where police officer, well, in fact, I spoke in confidence to a police officer at the weekend who told me that they were being told not to make warrant arrests. So where they found someone who was wanted on a warrant, not to arrest them because there was nowhere to put them. If you arrest them on a warrant, the only ones they were allowed to arrest were murderers and rapists. Anyone else that was wanted, maybe had absconded, hadn't attended court, etc., if you catch them, you got to let them go because there's no cell for them. There's nowhere to put them. You can't. There's no space in the local prisons. And they were with one. They had to drive someone they arrested for something quite serious on a warrant. They had to drive him 100 miles to find a police cell to put him in, and that's a whole squad of police officers driving 100 miles to put someone in a police cell 100 miles away, only for another load of police officers to have to drive him all the way back to where he came from to go to court, and then all the way back. It's just a form of insanity that you cannot get your head around when you realise there are 85-year-old men in prison who have been there for 40 years because they committed a terrible murder a long time ago. But really, do they need to be in prison at that age? Are there no other way we can do it to free up some room for rapists who are out there raping now? It's crazy. We have disabled people, we have all sorts of people with chronic mental health conditions who don't belong there, And if they were in the right places, which would be secure psychiatric institutions for many of them, or mixed security, depending on the nature of the things that they've done and their risk, then we would have room for the people who really need to be in prison. And in my view, the people who need to be in prison are principally prolific sex offenders. Because in my 30-something years of criminal practice, the one group of offenders who are the most stubborn in their recidivism, regardless of what you do to them, are recidivist sex offenders. And they need, of course, we need to deal with them differently. We need to try and find a new way to change that mindset and to use the latest thinking and the latest psychological and therapeutic kind of techniques to try and divert people away from those dangerous and terrible behaviours. But the truth is that most of them are on the streets because there's no courts to put them in and no police to investigate them. And that's why our rates of sexual violence in this country are so high. So we have this whole idea that we're going to go after these young kids on the streets who are involved in drugs and night crime, etc. And all these sort of rapists who often are, maybe not been in trouble before, or maybe they've managed to sort of navigate the system in a way that they get away with stuff. They're kind of okay wandering around and committing crimes, really nasty crimes that cause very serious harm to young people and to people of all ages. Whereas we have prisons full of the injured, the ill, the damaged and the traumatized. We've got everything upside down. I would focus all my efforts on the most recidivist group of sex offenders, and if I'm going to spend money, it's that group that I want to get into a custodial environment to de-risk the public, to de-risk the streets. Because I'm not against the use of custody where it's necessary, but the difference in my view is that you only use it where it's necessary. You only use it where it has some benefit to society. So if you remember, I said a few minutes ago, my overall guiding principle for criminal justice is, does it make the streets safer? Does it reduce the number of victims of crime? If it does, great. So locking up prolific sex offenders is a good thing, provided when they're in custody, everything you do is focused on risk reduction, harm reduction, and changing behaviour patterns. It's very, very hard. And in some cases, it doesn't work. And they do have to be in prison until they're physically incapable of committing crime, when they're so old that they can no longer actually physically do it. Although in some cases, I've seen sex offenders up into their 90s, and it is that ingrained in some of them. So get your priorities right is my overriding message. What's my priority? I have lots of children, right? My priority is that they're safe every day. Okay, and if a policy makes them less safe, which is what the criminalisation of children and young people does, I'm against it. If a policy makes them safer, which is a prolific sex offender who targets young people, is taken off the streets because we've got adequate resource to investigate and prosecute, that's good for me. That works both ways. So I'm not against prison. I'm not against. I'm against prison as it is now because it so fundamentally fails to achieve the objective of making people safer when they come out. That's the reason I'm against the system we have now. But I'm not against, in particular in the case of those who are prolifically violent and prolifically attack other people through sexual violence, those people that we need to have appropriate custodial environments for them to protect the public. So provided we protect the public at every stage, and what we do is intended to do that, we'll save money and we'll actually protect people from some of the worst things that could ever happen to them, which of course include all forms of sexual assault and sexual violence and rape. And that's where, as a society, I think we've gone completely wrong. I have women coming to me complaining that they can't get any justice after being raped, and I've supported a number of victims of rape through the criminal justice system. And in some cases to the point where their attacker was convicted and they felt a degree of protection and that the system had worked. In other cases where it totally failed them and the police investigations were inadequate and the person wasn't in the end convicted or prosecuted because of failures by the prosecution and the police. So I've seen all that happen, and I've seen it firsthand, the impact it has on victims of serious violence and serious crime. And for me, it's an abomination the way that we treat those victims, and we absolutely should be focused on their needs over the loud shouting about cracking down and punishing people, which dictates nearly everything that I see every day in my day job.
So do you think for people who are truly irreparable, someone like a diagnosed pervert or sex offender or a murderer who has no intent to ever fix himself, do you think that we should use the death punishment? Or do you think, because if you're locked in prison, that's sort of mental death rather than physical death. So do you believe in the death punishment?
No,
as a
not
way of
at
treating them?
all. I don't. I absolutely don't. For so many reasons. And again, I mean, I'm happy to kind of briefly answer the question, but you know, the idea of killing another human being is just beyond my comprehension, unless it's in self-defense or necessity, or obviously in times of war when you have no choice. Although you try and minimise that as much as possible, but the minute you bring in, and that ignores, of course, the fact that there is a significant miscarriage of justice rate, including amongst death row inmates. So you know, it's a non-starter as far as I'm concerned, and it totally misses the point because it's the opposite end of what I'm advocating. So I'm advocating for the minimalist intervention that achieves the maximum result. So in the case of young people, it might be a diversion that takes them into a space of safety, and gets them into sort of an education or environment where they can actually be supported effectively for their emotional needs. Maybe they have lots of neurodiversity, of course, in the criminal justice system, and in the prisons as well, where you know you can trace back through a combination of neurodiversity, undiagnosed, with no support, and mental health problems and drug addiction, all three, the holy trinity of prison. So when you kind of you kind of see all of that stuff, you apply minimum diversion. The death penalty is the exact opposite, because the only reason you apply the death penalty is out of a sense of vengeance and punishment. It pragmatically doesn't work unless you're planning on executing people as we did like the day after you arrest them. If you're going to give people due process, they're still going to be in prison for 20 years anyway, before finally you might get through all layers of appeal and every kind of possible thing. And even then you're going to make mistakes and execute the wrong people. So what you end up with in the States, where they have many, many thousands on death row, most of whom are not eventually executed because of legal reasons or some other reason. But you know, increasingly a large number are being executed in places like Texas in particular, and other parts of the South. But when you have that system, it just creates an industry in and of itself. Death row lawyers, the whole appeals process, it takes up vast amounts of the legal system's time just to argue about whether the person who may or may not have committed the crime, and yes, maybe mostly has committed the crime, but to argue about whether they should remain in prison for life or whether they should be executed. What's the point of that? It's another complete waste of money that doesn't make society safer, because you know the evidence is as clear as day that the death penalty doesn't deter violent crime. Otherwise, whoa, why has America got one of the highest rates of violent crime in the world when they've got the death penalty? And actually, they do use it, particularly frequently use it in places like Texas. So it's not a deterrent of any kind, any more than a 40-year sentence is a deterrent, or life without parole is a deterrent. And they have 60,000 in America serving life without parole, so they'll never be released. Some of them are in their late teens, early 20s, never to be released. So 70, 80, 90 years potentially in prison if they live that long, which many of them will. That to me is just it's a form of insanity. What you need to look at it is this way. So go back to my golden rule. And if you guys take on your kind of future journey, this got Chris's golden rule, you know, it's the pragmatic is: are we reducing crime? Are we making life better and safer for people? If you take that through life, the death penalty has absolutely no positive impact on that particular metric, and many negative ones, including the concept of opportunity cost, which I'm sure you very bright young men are very familiar with. So the opportunity cost of spending the 2 million on your prolific offender or on your death row inmate means you don't have that 2 million to spend on something that actually works and does reduce crime and does protect victims, including giving victims access to legal support and giving them proper victim support that isn't based on volunteers or charity as much of it is. Make it systemic, have a systemic support network, particularly for victims of sexual violence, where they can access therapy, they can access counselling, they can access, you know, information about the case and about the attacker. Are they on bail? If so, where are they living? And things like that, which often the women I've worked with on those sorts of cases say, I literally saw him walking down the street and he raped me 3 months ago. I didn't even know he'd been released. Things like that, you know, are so extraordinarily toxic and damaging to victims. Whereas something like the death penalty and the increasing tendency to give people whole life sentences, albeit we're keeping it to a relatively small number in this country, but it's happening more and more than ever, this idea of life without parole in the UK. It's all effectively a form of disinformation, and it's a way of distracting the public's attention from what's really going on in criminal justice, and it's very successful. So the short answer to your question is absolutely, the death penalty is a form of insanity that and something that goes back to, you know, it's been around for thousands and thousands of years, and it developed at a time of really simplistic moral thinking. You know, in Roman times and before, where very simplistic views were taken, about. And of course, the only people who ever got executed were poor people. I mean, very rarely did the rich get executed. There was always some get out for them anyway. So the death penalty, when you look at how often it's used against black people in America, often black people who come from the most traumatized backgrounds, often black people with significant either mental health or developmental disorders or other or psychological problems, they're the people that get targeted by the death penalty. The people who don't get targeted by the death penalty are really psychotic, long-term prolific sex offenders who may not kill but still cause inordinate harm to society. I'm not saying I'd give anyone the death penalty, but my point is that you end up just killing lots and lots of black people. That if you just go online and show me all the people that have been executed last year, and look at all the black faces and the Hispanic faces, and you realise this system is totally racially corrupt and completely immoral.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I mean, I think the financial argument is a massive fallacy that people make, but there's a deterrence effect I just don't get. I mean, especially when you're dealing with crimes like this, you're dealing with crimes in the heat at the moment. You're not going to be thinking of the consequence, and really, does life in prison? I think life in prison is a sufficient deterrent for any rational person. You're not going to risk that, but not risk the death penalty. I think Harry was right to touch on that as a question, because I think
definitely.
We've got quite a philosophically minded audience who like to think about these things, and it's always seemed very, very silly to me. At the end of the book, you touched on the dark web, and obviously that was a few years ago. I think 2019 it came out.
The book came out in 2020. Yeah, it was actually just when the dark web was kind of getting a bit of notoriety, and people it was breaking into the mainstream media. Nowadays, people understand it perhaps a bit more, but yeah, I wrote about that, having spent some time on it and looking at what you can see and what you can buy and what you can do, and being frankly shocked, but also it made me realize just how ridiculous the idea of trying to restrict drug trafficking is, because you can buy any drug you want sent to you by UPS from anywhere in the world on the dark web, and of course the principal market is for dealers rather than individual users, but it's there and there's nothing anyone can do about it.
Well, I wanted to ask you about how it's changed, in the sense that with the AI developments and things like that. I mean, how do you feel about the future, and what do you think the future of crime might look like?
I think you make a good point with AI. I think the future of crime is actually already here, and the future of crime is financial crime principally. So most of the sort of organised crime activity now outside of the drug trade, which of course is still a massive industry, but even the drug trade relies on the dark web and new supply chains and ever increasingly clever ways of getting drugs from A to B to C. But what the dark web does, and the way that it works is in effect, it means that there is a stratum of lawlessness, a worldwide stratum of lawlessness, which is completely unregulated, except for those very, very few occasions when they have the good fortune to make an arrest, and even then, like what does it do? So I wrote in the book about the famous sort of dark web, Pirate Bay market, which became kind of fairly notorious, and the dread pirate Roberts, who was eventually found, I think, in a coffee shop somewhere with his laptop open, and it was only because they kept his laptop open that they managed to basically prove it was him, and now he's in a Supermax in Colorado, for the rest of his life. But a very clever guy, actually. A point I was making earlier, these people are not stupid; they're just criminals under the current state of the law. But the point where all of that takes me. So nowadays, anyone who wants to can install an Onion browser and VPN and go and basically buy anything, from a machine gun to a kilo of heroin to a child prostitute and all of the stuff that's on there. And what it kind of made me realise was that, rather like the internet generally, I think, is that you have to think about what you can control, not what you can't. And so I think you often hear politicians and government, are we going to regulate, we're going to prosecute people, we catch these dark web operators, etc., etc. My view is that that's just utterly futile, because I'm not saying that you shouldn't seek. I mean, law enforcement are all over the dark web. Obviously, they're looking at stuff. They create false accounts. They set people up. And they arrest a certain number of people through that activity. But rather like the physical drug markets of Manchester or London or anywhere else, that doesn't matter how many people you arrest, there's going to be a load more. And the ones that you get next might not be as good and nice and friendly and community orientated as the ones you've got now. I'm not saying drug dealers like that really, but the point is that it's all about unintended consequences. And the way that I look at it is this: that you can only police and control what you can control. That means you should look at supporting people and communities through improving life and education and employment and the general standard of living in a society, particularly for those on the margins of society who are the least economically advantaged and the least educated. And by doing so, you effectively take certain people out as consumers out of that market for all of these illegal and dangerous kind of subjects or extremely damaging activities like people trafficking and so forth. So I kind of look at it that the dark web is to this day, and the use of AI, all of it does is it makes it easier to commit fraud. It makes it easier, for example, to create phishing emails that actually are credible and don't have loads of stupid spelling mistakes and don't have the wrong kind of email address or spell Barclays wrong or all of the stuff that much of the sort of phishing fraud does. Once AI becomes involved in phishing fraud, then AI can be highly personalized, so the individual can sound exactly like it is their bank or their best friend talking to them on an email or a message and everything else. So we are seeing a vast explosion in consumer fraud, identity theft type fraud, partly because AI can make those activities so much more convincing and so much more pernicious, and also to operate at scale. So you can operate at vast scale using AI. If you get a dump of illegal, of illegally obtained bank details, credit card details, etc. Now, previously, if you got that in a spreadsheet or something like that, it's kind of a manualized process. It's not that easy to end up with really convincing fraudulent phishing emails. You put the same data into AI, of course, the emails are going to be unbelievable because they're going to pick all the real details from the stolen information that's been bought on the dark web, and they're going to make whatever the messaging, whether it's text messages or with links to go and click through to do some security thing or whatever it may be. So all of that activity is being hugely increased and enabled by AI, along with, frankly, I think the least known form of crime right now in our society, and one of the largest, if not the largest. I know it's your interview. We're going to ask you now worldwide, okay? Bigger than the drugs trade, what do you think that crime is? This is good for your audience. They'll be thinking, what could it be? I don't know. The answer is ad fraud, advertising fraud. So every time you go online and you see an ad for a banner ad or any form of advertising online, those ads, most of the clicks on those ads are fraudulent and fake. They are bot clicks, and AI allows the creation of bot clicks to the point that so you have a website created by fraudsters, which takes the advertising traffic from Google or whoever, and essentially creates the illusion that website has thousands of people clicking through and looking at the ads and then clicking through onto the websites. All of that is fake, all of it artificial, and the value of that fraudulent activity is hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And at the moment, governments around the world are doing very little about it. But it has a big impact if you think about it, because if hundreds of billions of ad spend is going directly to fraudsters, that means that the cost of all of the advertising has doubled when you think about it, because if an advertiser is spending, as Coca-Cola is spending, I don't know, $1 billion a year, and 500 million of that is going to fraudsters, that means that the product itself has to cost more to pay the 500 million, and it means the profit of the company is reduced by the 500 million, which means that the shareholders, and they might be pensioners or anyone else that's holding these big name companies that do a lot of advertising in their pension portfolio or investments or ISAs, all of those people suffer. So across the board, financial crime driven by AI driven by access to illegally obtained data and hacking. Of course, we've seen Marks and Spencers recently. We've seen all of these big retailers. The Legal Aid Agency yesterday was hacked, and I don't know if you thought about that. So that meant that millions of people, victims of crime, all their identity, people's criminal records. Once you get access to stuff like that, you think about it. If you've got access to all of the sex offenders' information who have ever applied for legal aid, you can blackmail people. There's all sorts of things that you can do. So sort of AI-driven kind of fraud, in my view, is going to be it already has outgrown drugs as in the global market, but unless advertisers find a way to combat and traffic that fraud and defeat that fraud, rather, it is going to become more and more prevalent. And of course, why would you be a drug dealer and risk 50 years in prison when you can have some clever coder sitting in a village in India or in Uzbekistan or wherever with a vast tower of computers and access to the latest AI technology anonymously? Why would you take the risk of going to prison or getting executed in some countries for trafficking drugs when you could just siphon off cash straight into your bank account by fraud? And that's the reality of technology, and that's then criminals are very, very they're very adaptable, and they have adapted and used the technology in a way that these large corporations who have very deep pockets have just not been able to stop. Did you have any idea it was ad fraud, by the way? Would that have crossed your radar at any point?
I would
you
have
may have
guessed
heard about it.
like colliery, but not ad fraud. No.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary thing. People these ads that we mostly ignore anyway.
Yeah.
But if you think about the vast amounts that are spent by advertisers on social media and online, the fact that so much of it is hijacked and just not real is something that perhaps surprises people. And many people wouldn't necessarily think through the levels of damage that does to the economy, to society, etc. They just go, oh, well, Coca-Cola, they can afford it.
Not least giving you an enormous page count as well.
Well, there is that. Yeah, there is that.
Just on the topic of AI briefly, as it continues to develop and if it becomes conscious or something like that, how would you go about prosecuting something that isn't human?
Well, you can't prosecute something that isn't human. You can only prosecute. It's rather like, you don't prosecute a car for running someone over, do you? And you prosecute the driver, and it's exactly the same. You're talking about if AI becomes conscious, which that's quite a big leap, and actually it simply isn't consistent with the technology as it is now, in the sense that we mean conscious as human beings, or even as animals, generally. The levels of consciousness are very different in an organic being than essentially a binary system that is all it does is take binary numbers and turn them into other things, whether that be pictures or text or what have you. And that's all it can do. And in some ways, I think people need to be a little bit less afraid of it. It can be scary, and it can, for reasons we've just talked about, it can be used to do great harm and to steal money and to do all sorts of other terrible things, influence elections, whatever you want to choose. But looking at the AI as the issue, rather than looking at the people who create, develop, and then use and to a degree seek to regulate the AI, I think is a mistake, because, truth be told, AI can probably save 1 billion lives a year within a decade in terms of the impact on healthcare. When what the NHS is doing with big data, taking 2 or 3 million people and getting their entire DNA profile and their whole health histories through the NHS, and then crunching all of that data through AI, is going to save thousands and thousands and thousands of lives. But it's not the AI that's doing that. It's the clever people that are finding the applications. Yeah. Exactly. And so the things it's used for good, the AI isn't responsible. The AI is the tool. Just as when you invent, a new medicine, it's the person who invented the medicine is the clever one. The medicine is just a compound that's been there since time began. So all you're doing is you're using something that effectively has always been there as a possibility. Transistors, everything, all the things in a computer, all the things in a big rack of AI chips are all from the planet. They're all here all along. They've all been here since the Big Bang. All of it. And all that's happening is that ingenious human beings are taking the ingredients available to us on our planet, and they're making them do really, really clever things. And some of them are doing clever good things, some of them are doing clever bad things. But the AI is here to stay, and it is going to change our society dramatically. It will become something. If we stick to sort of my subject area of criminal justice, it will become a battle between the AI that's being developed and used for good by law enforcement and by the government and by reputable corporations, etc., and the AI that criminals and others who are looking to subvert societies and subvert systems for political reasons or economic reasons. You just end up with an arms race, don't you? And who's got the cleverest AI? Who's got the biggest data centers? Who's got the best software to sort of, and the best APIs to kind of engage with the AI? And that's what we're going to see. The next decade is going to be the battle for supremacy between the dark forces of AI and the forces for good, and both will have their successes, in my opinion.
But what I was trying to get at was, I like the argument of how you're saying human beings basically have the ingredients and they're combining it to make AI and whatnot. So if I bake a cake or something like that and the cake turns bad, you don't blame the cake, you blame the cook. But then what if the cake suddenly grew arms and legs and a mouth and started killing people? What if the AI actually became conscious? How would you treat it? Like, it's not the people's fault.
Hypothetically, well, it is the people's fault because if you have something that can not only become conscious and self-aware, and of course this is a sort of science fiction trope that's been going back 50, 60, 70 years, but if you have artificial intelligence that becomes self-aware and then becomes evil and decides to kind of do harm to human beings, the fault lies with the people who developed the system and didn't build in sufficient safeguards. It doesn't lie with basically silicone sitting in a data center. I mean, of course, you could, if you're talking about a combination, because the real movie trope, of course, is not the computer alone, it's the computer in robotized form. So taking on physical form, perhaps with superhuman physical capabilities, as well as, the Terminator kind of scenario. I mean, once you get to that stage, then of course you're in a lot of trouble as a society, because you will effectively, it's rather like putting landmines. If you go and lay landmines in a war, that's a problem for a very long time to come. And the problem is not the landmines, because they are just bits of metal and bits of explosive. The problem is whoever had the bright idea of putting landmines all over a field near a village. And that's the way I look at AI. If we as a society create these sort of AI landmines whereby they can, there could be harm done to human beings by systems created by human beings without human intervention. That's the difference, isn't it? Because, as I said earlier, of course, humans can use AI for evil purposes and good purposes. But the minute that you have AI that's capable independently of being self-aware and of doing bad things to the human species, and if you combine that with robotics, then you have a big problem. And as a society moving forward over the next decade, regulating and thinking about AI, that's going to be something which is going to come out of the realms of science fiction and into the realms of the possible. Although, the one thing we can be sure of, if you've ever been in a self-driving car or anything like that, I was in LA a few months back, and I don't know if you know, but they have completely self-driving taxis called Waymos, which you just get picked up anywhere and they take you anywhere, and there's no driver, and you just sit in the back. Well, that's as extreme, really, on a sort of social level, if you like, as the capabilities have got for autonomous kind of robot activity. And it's not very clever, and it can only respond to, it has a minimal number of inputs. If you think about a human being, the number of, so although they have managed to get, and cars are actually quite an interesting model because they are relatively simple, because they go faster or slower and they turn direct. I mean, there's a limited number of things a car can do, whereas a human being has millions of different inputs at every single moment. I mean, at this moment in time, the number of things I'm taking in, looking that way, looking, around, I can see the screen, I can see you guys. Now, AI can kind of can approximate some of those inputs, but what it can't do at the moment is replicate the sheer number of different inputs and different computations that a human being can make in real time. If you run stuff through AI, it's very, very effective at crunching data but it's a tiny, tiny fraction of how effective either of you are. And that's not just because you're very bright young people, but the human brain is infinitely more complex. So is it possible that we get to something that approximates to what you might call pseudo humanity, or something that kind of looks a bit like consciousness as we kind of know it, and a bit like emotion? My view is no, you can't ever. It's not possible, for the simple reason that it is a system built entirely on the back of binary calculations and numbers. And that's all it is, and that's all it's ever going to be. It can never be anything different. And that, you can never have the complex emotional neural networks and everything else, because all AI is doing, and this is why it's actually quite difficult to kind of to grapple with when people use it for the first time, and some people get into a bit of a rabbit hole with it because they're convinced that it's unbelievable. Like, it literally seems to understand me. It knows everything about like everything, and it can tell me everything. The truth is, it's not. It's artificial intelligence, and what it's doing is it's just crunching a load of stuff off the internet, and it's working out very quickly what the best sequence of words will be to kind of fulfill its mission of keeping you engaged and using the system, which is what ChatGPT and all these companies want to do. It's exactly doing that. So it's an illusion, if you like, and that does make it dangerous. But in my view, the idea that it could become have the same level of consciousness as a human being, it's possible. But in my view, first of all, it would require quantum computing. The current computing methods of using racks and racks of AI chips in these data centers all over the place, which are being built, simply doesn't have the processing capacity in real time to approximate the mind of a human being. The minute that you get effective quantum computing, whereby all of the different points, all of the different data points are all visible to the system instantly, as they are to me in my garden, I can instantly take in everything around me, not just because of my eyes, because my brain principally is processing all the different things. Once you end up with that level of consciousness, if you like, from quantum computing, because a quantum computer has similar characteristics to a human brain, although once again, it's still a computer and it's still working binary numbers and code rather than real consciousness. But once you get quantum computing, the processing speed and power is so fast that the illusion will become increasingly real, and that's dangerous, but it's an opportunity at the same time. But perhaps the most important thing is it's here to stay. We're stuck with it. So what we should be doing is, how do we engage with this technology in a way that maximizes? Why don't we do what I do? How do we do the most good for society and create the best lives for people using this technology? If that's our objective, and that's how we create our regulatory structures, that's how the government invests and regulates and taxes, etc. In with that mindset. So if we talk about medical AI that's focused on saving lives, reducing the number of people who get cancer, die of heart disease, using it to create new genetic therapies so that babies who would otherwise have died can become fully healthy, then all of that, you massively need to hugely prioritize and invest in that technology. And at the same time, you do need to find some way of seeking to regulate particularly larger corporations in their use of AI for really nasty purposes. And for me, TikTok is the prime example of the nasty AI. So the TikTok algorithm and the way that it's used to manipulate children's brains, and how effective it is at manipulating children's brains, that's a very, very worrying situation that we face at the moment, where children, very young children often, I know there's age limits, but there are very young children using TikTok, and TikTok content, because of the algorithm, can become extremely dark extremely quickly, particularly for children. We have seen suicides, we've seen other kind of events where the algorithm drives people down rabbit holes of depression and psychosis and all sorts of other things like that. When it comes to that, we as a society, we need information. What we're not going to be able to do is stop the idea of banning TikTok or banning these things. I don't believe it's realistic, because I've got a teenage son. He can get around anything. It's not, if you bring in a system, you ban X, Y, and Z, it'll give him 5 minutes on a VPN and he'll have solved it. So the idea that you can't, that you're ever going to actually be able to stop these things and stop access to them for children is ridiculous. So you have to educate instead. Rather like drugs, the same point, right? So you're never going to stop drugs. That doesn't mean you give kids heroin. What it means is that you give them the education, the tools they need to understand how drugs work, where the dangerous areas are and where perhaps the less dangerous areas are, and give them the tools to navigate the world in a way that they're informed. and you have to do the same. We have to bring AI into the national curriculum, in my view. It has to be an important part of our education system in a way that it isn't right now. I've got two kids, one's doing GCSEs this year, one doing A-levels, and AI doesn't feature at all in any of their syllabus, across their syllabuses. I mean, occasionally it's used for bits and pieces, and they use it for revision, like self-taught and that kind of stuff. But the truth is, it should be at the heart of every subject, because it will be at the heart of every subject within 5 to 10 years. So the quicker we get round to educating young people, particularly children in school, etc., from a very young age, about the benefits of AI and the informed dangers of it, the better.
You've tied in children and drugs and the future like beautifully together. That's sort of everything we've been talking about today. Chris, thank you for being so generous with your time. That was really, really, really engaging. What else? So Justice on Trial is fantastic. You narrate your own audiobook, which I love. It's accessible, it's clear for a non-specialist audience, and you've got some TV work coming up. What's going on?
Well, it's interesting you ask. So I've got a production company which I run with my fiance Alice, and her background is entertainment and music business, and TV and movies, and we have within Framewood Media we've got a number of TV projects. But the one that perhaps is most interesting from sort of your listeners' point of view is a project called Raising the Bar. So I was going back to sort of TikTok and YouTube and content like that. We've decided to make a show for social media, principally YouTube, but other platforms as well, about the journey to becoming a barrister. And we're going to offer a real pupillage for a real candidate who's been through the education process and done all their law exams and got their bar exams, their bar training course, etc. And we're going to have a really interesting and unusual social media driven project where we will follow their journeys. And the idea of it is, we'll go back to the diversity I talked about earlier, we want to have candidates from almost every decade of life. So we want people who are certainly in their 20s, but we're going to want candidates in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and even possibly beyond. And we want the most diverse and eclectic group of candidates to become barristers that's ever been assembled. And we want to give them huge amounts of support, take them right through the process, but actually the journey will be, will be shown on YouTube. There'll be other content we will go on TikTok, we will go on Instagram and other platforms, for the simple reason that, that's how you reach the audience that we want to reach, which is principally 20-somethings and 30-somethings who either are interested in sort of the law, legal careers, and how you get to do these things, or just rather like people who watch The Apprentice, who just want to see what it looks like for different personalities to go through a really, really difficult process with a really, really hard to achieve reward at the end. So Raising the Bar will be coming to your phones and your tablets, but not your televisions unless you watch that stuff on television, over the next 12 months or so. And in fact, we're going to start recruiting candidates in the autumn this year.
Fantastic, Chris.
Well, if you could get everybody to go to my YouTube channel, which is Daw KC, that would be amazing, because that's the place they're going to find out all about Raising the Bar. But they'll also find you guys will find a huge amount of content, which I recorded some of it some time ago, for young people going into education, trying to aspire to be lawyers, just looking to move ahead. Whatever wisdom I've accrued over 30 odd years, of navigating the legal system, the legal profession, there's quite a lot of it on the YouTube channel, and I've had a lot of positive feedback from people who have said, like, this is really helpful to me. So anyone who's interested in legal career in particular would be wise to go to my YouTube channel.
The YouTube channel will be linked below, along with the book. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Good stuff, guys, and a really interesting talk.
Thanks, Chris. See you.